What happens when you have an engine fire on takeoff, and how soon should the passengers evacuate? Check out this audio, and then we're going to take a look at the NTSB key lessons learned for both flight crew and passengers.
American 383 Heavy, turn left heading 220, runway 28 right at November 5, clear for takeoff.
Left turn to 220, clear for takeoff, American 383 Heavy. American 383 Heavy, stopping on the runway.
Roger, fire.
You see any smoke or fire?
Yeah, fire off the right wing.
Okay, send out the truck.
Sending them.
That was American Airlines Flight 383, and on October 28, 2016, they were rolling down the runway at a high speed, about to take off from Chicago to Miami when they experienced an uncontained right engine fire. And before we dive into all the details about what happened, I want to make two very important points. First, passengers shouldn't be worried that something like this is going to happen to them. The odds of this happening to your flight are about 1 in 11 million, and you're going to see proof of that shortly. So please continue to fly, and I hope to see you on my flight one day. Second, I'm not here to pretend that I could have done any better than the crew did with the training and the procedures they had in place at the time this happened. It's very easy for anyone to sit here and talk about how they would have handled certain parts of this situation differently, but until you really put yourself in a high stress situation such as this, you can't really judge how the crew actually handled things. American Airlines Flight 383 is a Boeing 767 aircraft with 161 passengers, 2 pilots, and 7 flight attendants. Now, it was early in the afternoon and there were overcast skies, but the visibility was good and weather isn't really going to play a role in this incident. However, when it comes to visibility, one thing that you need to know about the 767 is that it's not possible for the pilots to see the engines from where they're sitting in the cockpit, and the flight attendants in the front of the plane also can't see the engines, and this is going to play a factor in this emergency and how it was handled. The pilots are both highly experienced. The captain has over 17,000 hours of flight time, and the first officer has about 22,000 hours. And just to show you how rare an incident like this is, during the investigation, the captain stated that in his 30-plus year career, he had never experienced an engine failure or evacuation except in simulator training. And I'll admit that even during my 20-year career in the military, I only had an engine fire one time, and it was on the ground after a long combat sortie, and there are tens of thousands of pilots that'll fly 20 or 30 years over the course of their career and never experience anything like this at all. Everything about the day starts off normal, and the plane taxis and they're cleared to take off from runway 28 right at November 5. And if you're curious why they don't use the full runway, it's because the runway is 13,000 feet long and this intersection takeoff leaves them almost 10,000 feet of runway remaining, which is more than enough. But more importantly, this also allows all of the planes landing on runway 28 center to taxi down Papa and then cross 28 right behind the departing aircraft, so there's no potential for a runway incursion. Ultimately, the shortened runway is not going to be a factor in this incident. As the plane picks up speed to take off, there are a few key things that you need to know. Because the captain is the pilot flying this leg, he's the one performing the takeoff. And his job during that takeoff is to keep the aircraft tracking down the runway center line and focus outside. Now the first officer, he's the pilot monitoring, so his job is really to support the captain, but during the takeoff, his job is to pay attention to the aircraft engines, the airspeed, any abnormal indications, as well as make a few specific callouts to the captain. Now the first call out that he has to make is 80 knots, and he just says 80 knots. And this call is important because most captains will brief that they won't abort the takeoff above 80 knots unless they have an engine failure, fire, or basically anything that is going to prevent the airplane from getting airborne. Once the plane gets above 80 knots, the next speed that the pilots care about is called the V1 speed. Now the reason this speed is so important is because V1 is the maximum speed that the plane can be going when the pilot must take the first action to abort the takeoff and still be able to stop in the remaining runway. Basically, if you try to abort above V1 speed, you're most likely going to go off the end of the runway. This speed is also very important because it's also the minimum speed that the plane needs to still be able to take off if one engine fails. In this case, the calculated V1 speed is 134 knots, and what happens to American Airlines Flight 383 is a scenario that pilots specifically train for. You see, when pilots are going through training, one of the maneuvers that they're required to demonstrate proficiency on is something known as a V1 cut. This is basically where you're performing a takeoff in the simulator and the instructor gives you an engine failure or a fire right at your V1 speed, and you have to maintain control of the aircraft while also dealing with the emergency and the loss of thrust all at the same time. Now what's crazy about this incident is that the V1 speed is 134 knots and the engine failure happens at 128 knots. So they're only 6 knots away from V1 when the pilots hear a loud bang, they feel the aircraft shake and veer to the right and experience a sudden loss of thrust. And according to the NTSB, it took just 1.2 seconds after hearing that loud bang for the captain to initiate the rejected takeoff maneuver and move the throttles to idle. 1 second later, the auto brakes kick in, and this just so happens to be right at 134 knots, which was their V1 speed. So think about that. The captain had about 2 seconds after hearing the loud bang and feeling the vibration to process what had just happened and make the decision to abort. If he had delayed for those 2 seconds to try to figure out what was really going on, they likely would have been above their V1 airspeed, and he'd have had the difficult task of trying to take off with one engine on fire or risk going off the end of the runway. Now listen again to the audio where the first officer calls the tower, and keep in mind that this first radio call is made about 5 seconds after the captain moves the throttles to idle.
American 383 Heavy stopping on the runway.
Roger, fire.
Do you see any smoke or fire?
Yeah, fire off the right wing.
Okay, send out the truck.
Sending them.
Did you notice how concise and efficient the communication was with the tower? Now the NTSB didn't really make much note about this, but I think it's important to highlight what a good job the first officer did with this. Fortunately, even though they were right at their V1 speed when they abort, the plane is still able to stop with about 3,700 feet of runway remaining, and that's when they begin evacuating the aircraft, the passengers start to panic, and there's a few things that didn't go so well according to the NTSB. As the plane is starting to slow down, the pilots don't know they have an engine fire until that radio call from tower. The captain calls for the engine fire checklist approximately 20 seconds after the loud bang associated with the engine failure. And I know that might seem like a long time, but remember he's trying to keep the aircraft under control, and the plane doesn't come to a stop for at least 5 more seconds after they start that checklist. Also, they don't actually get an engine fire indication in the cockpit until the plane had slowed down to about 35 knots. And even when that happens, because of the limited visibility, the first officer can't really look out his window and see the right engine. So he has no idea how big the fire is. In fact, during a post-accident interview, he said he was surprised to see the flames on the right side of the plane because he expected to see a small fire. What's interesting is that as the plane is still rolling down the runway before coming to a stop, passengers on the right side are already getting out of their seats and moving to the left side of the plane. And this is the part that's really important for passengers because this is how at least one passenger gets seriously injured. One of the things that pilots are taught regarding aborted takeoffs is that passengers might panic because they have no idea why the plane is slamming on the brakes. It could be for a minor malfunction, another plane on the runway, or in this case a major engine fire. And that's why the guidance that the crew had at the time was that if they know that an evacuation is not required, then they should make an announcement saying, "This is the captain, remain seated, remain seated, remain seated." However, the guidance also stated that if an evacuation might be required, then you should consider configuring the aircraft for the evacuation, such as shutting down both engines, and then the captain should give the order saying, "This is the captain, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate." But the problem was the pilots didn't really know how bad that fire was, and the training and guidance they had stated that the captain should consider that smoke or flames in the engines will normally burn out quickly and not endanger the cabin, and you should only consider evacuating if the fire doesn't extinguish or appears to be spreading. Now in this situation, the captain does start to make an announcement for the passengers to evacuate, but his announcement is cut off, and it actually happens about 1 minute after the plane has come to a stop, and so at that point the passengers were already evacuating. One of the things that a lot of airline captains will brief their first officer is that as the captain is performing the abort, the first officer will make the announcement telling the passengers to remain seated. Because even if they know that they're going to need to evacuate, the captain still needs time to get the aircraft stopped and get the engine shut down and provide guidance about the evacuation. However, it's important to keep in mind that the flight attendants don't necessarily have to wait for that evacuation order in the event of a life-threatening situation. So what's happening is, as the plane comes to a stop, the pilots are completing the checklist to shut down the right engine and discharge the fire extinguishing agent, while the left engine is still running at idle power. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, But right now, the passengers are bum rushing the exit doors to evacuate the plane because a lot of them can see the fire on the right-hand side and they're starting to panic. The flight attendants are trying to regain control of the situation, and they're directing the passengers to remain seated because they want to hear from the pilots, because they need to make sure that the engines are shut down before they start evacuating everyone. Now, there are two ways that the flight attendants can communicate with the pilots. The one that they use every day is the interphone, and they tried to use it, but one flight attendant pushed the wrong button. Another was overwhelmed by the passengers and in the stress of the situation couldn't remember which button to push. And the third flight attendant may have picked up the phone without actually making the call, or may have had difficulty connecting. Either way, the other option they had was an evacuation signaling system that would have provided an alert for the pilots that the evacuation had begun, but none of the flight attendants activated it. Remember, they've got passengers out of their seats screaming to evacuate. And in fact, one of the passengers sitting in the left wing exit row recalls that the flight attendant told him to stay seated as the plane came to a stop, but he didn't listen. And even though he never heard any order to evacuate, he opened up the left overwing exit only 15 seconds after the plane came to a stop. Unfortunately, there are three big problems right now. The first is that the left engine is still running and the left overwing slide is deployed, and that first passenger is out on the wing and going down the slide just 31 seconds after the plane comes to a stop. And as soon as he gets up from the slide to try to run away, he gets blown down by the engine. And remember, that left engine is only at idle power. The second problem is that because there's no clear evacuation order or guidance, passengers are just rushing towards all the exit doors. Now, this is a problem because the flight attendant responsible for door 1 right has passengers rushing at her screaming, "Fire, open the door." And because her seat position doesn't allow her to see the right engine, she opens that right door only to discover the fire. So now she's having to block her exit and redirect people to the exits on the left side of the plane. The third problem is that the 4 left exit door can't be used yet because that slide is getting blown around by the left engine. Ultimately, it takes 1 minute and 11 seconds after the plane stops before the left engine is fully shut down and the 4 left slide is usable. And if you're wondering what's going on in the cockpit, they're following the procedures as prescribed in the checklist for the engine fire and then the evacuation checklist. They never hear from the flight attendants, and although they do get a door indication on their ICAS to let them know that the cabin doors are open, that message only pops up for a brief second and it's lost in all the other alerts that they're getting for the engine fire as they're shutting down those engines. Now, despite the delay in shutting down the left engine, the confusion about the evacuation, and the fact that some of the passengers are actually trying to take their luggage with them, all 161 passengers managed to get off the plane in just 2 minutes and 21 seconds after the plane stops. By the time the pilots exit the cockpit, all the passengers are already off the plane, and only the lead flight attendant is left. And at that point, the cabin is so filled with smoke that the captain can't even see if anyone was left behind. Overall, I think the quick reaction of the captain and the actions of the entire crew saved the lives of everyone on board. I think they did a great job at handling a situation they never expected to encounter at the worst possible time. And if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out another one on the screen here, and I'll see you next time on Pilot Debrief.